On the night of June 3rd, 1981, 14 prospectors, men who had come to Arizona chasing gold, silver, or whatever hope they had left, were shot across a 19-mile stretch of desert road known locally as Dust Road, a strip of sun-rotted asphalt cutting through the Gila Mountains. All 14 were adults. All 14 were eliminated with cold precision, high-powered rifle rounds, close-range shotgun blasts, ambushes from the ridge lines, the kind of tactical efficiency that didn't belong in the desert and certainly didn't belong in a dispute over an abandoned mine shaft nobody had touched for 40 years. The killers were later identified as the Cordell family, a father and 3 sons who had lived in the Gila backcountry since the 1950s. According to investigators, the killings were not about drugs, not about cartel money, not about stolen equipment or land deeds. They were about one mine. A mine that didn't even produce gold. A mine that barely produced anything by 1947. What it did produce was something far more dangerous in the desert. Ownership, followed by pride, and eventually blood. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events, and the motives behind it may be more disturbing than the acts themselves. Arizona in 1981 wasn't the postcard version outsiders imagined. Not in Gila County, not along Dust Road. Temperatures hit 103 degrees by noon. The heat radiating off the sand like an oven door left open. By midnight, the temperature only dipped to the 80s, but the air stayed bone dry, carrying the smell of sun-baked rock, creosote bushes, rattlesnake dens, and abandoned mining shacks, long since swallowed by sand. When the wind picked up, it didn't feel like wind. It felt like sandpaper, dragged across your face. You could hear the desert too, always hear it. Winds slicing across the mesas. The distant rumble of trucks on Route 77. Coyotes calling at dusk. And sometimes, late at night, shots echoing from far-off prospecting camps, where lonely men drank too much and settled old grudges. Gila County had been drying up for decades. The mining boom that built the region in the 1920s had collapsed. By 1981, only a handful of old-timers still chased ore, hoping to strike one last vein before their hands or their luck gave out. Most lived in trailers or rust-eaten pickup beds on Bureau of Land Management property. The Cordell mine stood west of Dust Road, dug into a rocky ridge called Muleback Mountain. Abandoned in 1941, reopened in 1956, abandoned again by 1963. No maps marked it anymore. No state records listed it as active or hazardous. But in the desert, official paperwork mattered far less than local belief. And locals believed one thing with eerie uniformity. The Cordells owned that shaft, owned it with their blood, owned it whether the law agreed or not. John Red Cordell, the patriarch, was 61 in 1981, though the desert had aged him a decade past that. 6'3", shoulders like a railroad tie, skin so sun-scarred it looked carved from sandstone. A Korean war vet who came home with shrapnel in his thigh and a distrust of all authority, especially federal. Red raised 3 sons in a house made of scrap lumber and corrugated metal, 6 miles west of Dust Road. Carl Cordell, 33, the planner. Jonah Cordell, 31, silent, unpredictable. And Elias Cordell, 27, the youngest, quickest shot, meanest temper. The Cordells didn't work steady jobs, didn't pay property taxes, didn't file income returns. Their money came from odd jobs, scavenging, small-time prospecting, and a network of desert trades outsiders never understood. But what Red valued most wasn't money. It was territory. Territory his father had claimed with dynamite and a hand-drawn map during the Depression. Territory that Red believed no outsider had the right to touch. The mine shaft was worthless in the eyes of geology. But in the eyes of the Cordell family, it was inheritance, it was identity, it was law. And when 14 prospectors staked their tents near the entrance in late May 1981, everything began to slide toward violence. The men weren't a unified group. They wandered into Arizona in waves, some old, some young, some drifters, some dreamers, some chasing rumors of silver veins, left untouched during World War II shutdowns. Names like Reed Morrow, 58, former construction worker; Hector Ruiz, 41, a war veteran from Texas; Dean Fuller, 32, ex-mechanic chasing a fresh start; Peter Lang, 27, who had never panned a day in his life; Samuel and Henry Briggs, brothers, 47 and 49, and 8 more who simply wanted a piece of desert nobody claimed. Except someone did claim it, and they claimed it with bullets. The prospectors' one unforgivable mistake: hammering a wooden claim marker into the ground, right at the mouth of the old Cordell shaft. They weren't trying to steal anything. They simply didn't know the Cordell family existed. But the desert remembers what men forget, and the Cordells saw that wooden stake as an act of war. 2 days before the killings, on June 1st, Red Cordell rode his mule down the slope into the prospector camp. He didn't yell, didn't wave a gun. He simply told them, "You're claiming what ain't yours. You got 2 sunsets to clear out." Witnesses would later describe his voice as eerily calm, like someone reciting scripture. The prospectors laughed it off. They had government-issued maps, BLM papers. They thought law protected them. But Dust Road didn't care about law, and the Cordells had already started preparing. The prospectors never understood how seriously they had misread the warning. To them, Red Cordell had been nothing more than a dusty old man on a mule, the kind of desert eccentric every mining camp eventually encountered. They assumed his threat was empty, a bark with no bite, a local trying to scare them off, an area they believed was legally claimable. By the morning of June 2nd, they had completely dismissed him. The men woke early, coffee boiling on small propane stoves, while the sun crept over the edge of Muleback Mountain. Heat rose almost instantly, shimmering over the ground in waves that made the horizon blur like a mirage. The prospectors worked through it, setting up crude drilling rigs, marking possible test points with orange tape, dragging noisy equipment across the gravel. Dust clung to every surface: faces, hands, the canvas of their tents. And by noon, the entire camp smelled of sweat, gasoline, and scorched metal. Some of the men joked about the mine-obsessed desert hermit, convinced he'd simply been trying to frighten them away from an old family story. Others argued that Even if the shaft had once belonged to the Cordells, it was abandoned now. "Open ground," one of them shouted. But they didn't understand how different the desert could be from the places they came from. They didn't understand that a man's claim in this land didn't depend on paperwork or government stamps. It depended on bloodlines, on memory, on fear. They didn't understand that the Cordell family believed every rock on Muleback Mountain still belonged to them. As the afternoon progressed, the camp began to settle into a tense, weary rhythm. The Briggs brothers argued loudly over drill depth. A younger prospector named Peter Lang kept wandering away to take photographs of the ridgeline, fascinated by the landscape. Reed Morrow remained unusually quiet, his brow furrowed, as if something unseen had been gnawing at him since dawn. Several times he scanned the distant hills, not sure what he was looking for, only knowing that he felt watched. By late afternoon, the temperature reached its peak. The desert air shimmered, heat rising in waves so sharp it distorted everything behind it. The sound of cicadas grew into an overwhelming metallic buzz. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. The men retreated to what little shade they could find, drinking warm water and passing around a single pair of binoculars to inspect the mine entrance from afar. None of them noticed the faint glint of glass higher up the slope. Jonah Cordell's scope, catching a strand of sunlight for half a second before disappearing again. When evening approached, a heavy stillness settled over the camp. The prospectors cooked canned beans and sausages over portable stoves, the smell mixing with sand and kerosene. They talked about home, about their families, about what they'd do with their earnings if the mine turned out profitable. Not one of them realized how badly they had misjudged the land they stood on. Not one of them grasped that the desert only grows still for one of two reasons: the coming of a storm or the coming of death. Just after 9 p.m., a sharp metallic sound echoed across the ridge, like iron striking stone. A few men paused mid-sentence, glancing up toward the dark slope. The noise came again, faint but unmistakable. Someone muttered that it was probably a goat or a mule kicking loose rock. Another man shrugged and said the desert always made strange sounds. The group returned to their conversations, but Reed Morrow didn't. He stared at the ridge for a long time, lips slightly parted, breath slow. Something was wrong. He felt it deep in his bones. It was the same feeling he'd had in Vietnam, the same quiet shift in the air that told him danger was moving nearby. He told the Briggs brothers they should pack up for the night and travel back to the road, but they laughed him off, calling him superstitious and overtired. At exactly 9:40 p.m., the generator coughed, sputtered, and died for the 5th time. The sudden darkness swallowed the camp. A few men cursed, fumbling for lanterns and flashlights. Others banged on the generator, trying to coax it back to life. In the darkness, only the distant silhouettes of the mountains remained visible, jagged and black against the faint moonlight. Then the coyotes began to scream. It started as a single wavering howl, then another, then a chorus, shrill, frantic, almost panicked. Old desert dwellers would have known immediately what it meant. Coyotes sense violence before humans do. They smell the tension, Hear the unnatural stillness. Feel the shift in the ground. To them, slaughter is a scent that arrives on the wind long before the blood spills. But none of these men were from the desert. Miles away, the Cordell family was finishing their preparations. Red had spent the early evening checking his rifle, tightening the sling, making sure the chamber was clean. His sons moved with mechanical precision. Jonah gathering extra ammunition, Carl loading his shotgun, and Elias pacing like a restless animal, his movements sharp and agitated. Their faces were set in grim determination. They believed the land had been violated, that the prospectors had crossed a sacred boundary. There would be no negotiation, no compromise. In their minds, justice had already been delayed too long. By the time the moon rose fully, the Cordells were already moving into position. Carl traveled ahead to cut off the single dirt road that could have provided escape. Jonah climbed the eastern ridge, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his steps silent on the rocky slope. Elias crawled across the western flank, watching the camp from above, waiting for movement. Red moved toward the wash, walking steadily, shoulders squared, breath slow. He wasn't rushing. He didn't need to. The prospectors had nowhere to run. At 11:12 p.m., without warning, the desert erupted. A single rifle shot broke the silence. The flash, brief but bright. One of the Briggs brothers dropped instantly, the impact throwing him backward into the dust. Before the others understood what was happening, a second shot echoed, then a third. Panic tore through the camp. Men shouted, stumbled, grabbed at lanterns, and fell over tent ropes. Someone screamed that they were under attack. Someone else yelled to run for the vehicles. But the vehicles were already blocked. More shots rang out from the ridge. Jonah was picking them off methodically, each pull of the trigger precise and steady. Elias fired from the opposite side, catching men as they tried to crawl behind boulders or flee toward the wash. Carl waited by the trucks, shotgun raised, ensuring no one could escape the route he guarded. And Red moved with an uncanny calm, firing only when he had a clear target, his silhouette barely visible against the black canvas of the desert night. The prospectors scattered in every direction, but it made no difference. The desert was too open. The Cordells had every angle covered. Within minutes, bodies littered the wash, twisted, dust-covered shapes illuminated by flickering lantern light. Some had tried to run, others to hide, others to fight. But none had been prepared for the precision and coordination of a family that had lived their entire lives hunting in the mountains. By 11:32 p.m., the screaming had stopped. Only the wind moved across the wash now, brushing through torn tents and overturned coolers. 14 men lay dead or dying, their tools scattered across the ground like relics of a failed expedition. Blood seeped into the sand, turning dark as it dried under the moonlight. Red Cordell surveyed the scene with cold satisfaction. His sons gathered around him, their breaths heavy, their clothes streaked with dust and soot. No one spoke. They simply stood in the moonlit wash, the silence settling around them like a blanket. After a long moment, Red said only one sentence. "The land remembers who it belongs to." Then they turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving the 14 bodies behind, knowing the desert sun would finish what they started. Dawn rose slowly on June 3rd, 1981, its first pale rays slipping over the jagged silhouette of Muleback Mountain and spilling across Dust Road like a quiet confession. The desert glowed faintly at first, soft oranges, muted reds, before the sun finally breached the horizon and revealed the full brutality of the night before. The wash where the 14 prospectors had made camp now looked like a battlefield, abandoned centuries ago. Their tents had collapsed inward, shredded by both bullets and panic. Toolboxes lay overturned, half buried in sand, kicked up during the chaos. Lanterns still flickered weakly, their fuel nearly drained, casting thin, trembling light over the lifeless shapes sprawled across the ground. For a long time after sunrise, nobody passed along Dust Road. That was normal. The road existed mostly for truckers who hauled equipment between forgotten mines or for the occasional Bureau of Land Management vehicle. And on summer mornings when the heat climbed fast and the sky remained cloudless, the desert often seemed completely devoid of human presence. But the desert was never truly empty, not of life, not of awareness, and certainly not of consequences. The first to sense that something unnatural had occurred were the vultures. They circled above the wash before the sun had even fully lit the scene, black silhouettes stretching across the sand like sinister omens. A few descended cautiously, landing near the Briggs brothers' bodies, but they did not approach. Even scavengers, it seemed, were unsettled by the way the men had fallen. Too many bodies, too close together, too violently ended. Soon after came the coyotes, approaching in timid, darting movements, sniffing the air, whining softly before backing away. The desert's predators rarely hesitated to claim the dead. But something about the brutality of the scene sent even them retreating. By mid-morning, the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees. Heat shimmered over the ground in long vertical waves. Blood darkened to rusty brown. Empty shell casings, partially buried in sand, caught glints of sunlight. The desert preserved everything in silence, like a crime scene beneath glass. It wasn't until 10:43 a.m. that the first human witness stumbled upon the aftermath. His name was Albert Givens, a retired electrical worker who lived alone in a decrepit RV several miles south of Dust Road. He made weekly trips to the town of Globe for supplies, always taking the same route, always passing the same wash. Givens drove slowly, partly because his truck was old, partly because the road demanded caution. That morning, as he approached the wash, he noticed something unusual, a lantern still glowing faintly in the broad daylight. It was enough to make him slow down, then stop entirely. He got out of his truck with some effort, his knees stiff, his breath labored. At first he thought the collapsed tents and scattered equipment meant the prospectors had simply left in a hurry. Then he saw the first body, then another, and another. Givens froze, gripping the side of his truck as though the metal could anchor him to reality. His stomach twisted. His head swam. He had lived in Arizona long enough to see his share of violence, but nothing remotely close to this. He stumbled back into his truck and tried to start the engine, but his hands shook so violently he dropped the keys. Twice. When he finally managed to turn the ignition, the truck jerked forward in the dirt, tires scattering dust as he sped toward the nearest ranger station. He didn't look back. He couldn't. When authorities finally arrived, a full hour later, the sun was vicious and unrelenting. Rangers, deputies, and investigators fanned out across the wash, marking each body, each shell casing, each blood trail. They moved slowly, taking photographs, whispering to each other in disbelief. The silence among them was nearly oppressive. Deputy Charles Lennox, a man who had served 15 years in Gila County law enforcement, later said he had never seen so many dead in one place without it being a military incident. One of the rangers vomited behind a rock. Another removed his hat and whispered, "My God, oh my God." What struck everyone most was the precision. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't a drunken brawl or a spontaneous firefight. The shooting had been coordinated, efficient, deliberate. Whoever had done this knew the terrain intimately. They had chosen their angles with care, cut off escape routes, and executed the attack with cold professionalism. There were no signs of robbery, no stolen vehicles, no missing equipment, nothing to suggest opportunistic violence. Everything pointed to one conclusion. The killers had wanted only one thing: to remove the men from this land. Investigators noticed immediately that the claim marker still stood at the mine entrance, its wooden shaft upright, untouched, almost defiantly visible. The men's paperwork lay neatly stacked in a waterproof container beside it, featuring maps, coordinate measurements, and official forms. Nothing had been tampered with. The killers hadn't cared about any of it. Reports were radioed in, photographs were taken, measurements recorded. The scene was mapped in meticulous detail. Yet the deeper the investigators dug, both literally and figuratively, the more they realized the killings had not been a crime of opportunity. They had been a message. A forensic examiner crouched beside one of the bodies and noted entry wounds consistent with long-range rifle fire. Another corpse displayed buckshot scattered across the torso and neck. Others bore signs of handgun rounds, fired at close proximity. This meant more than one shooter, possibly 3, maybe 4. As the deputies discussed possible motives, a ranger named Beverly Hart walked toward the old mine entrance to take photographs. She pulled back a torn tarp that had once served as makeshift shade for the prospectors, revealing a metal toolbox and several notebooks. She jotted down details, her camera clicking steadily. But as she stepped closer to the shaft, she noticed fresh footprints, large ones, deep set, likely from heavy boots. They led not into the mine, but away from it. Far away, toward the western slope. She called for the others. They gathered. They followed the prints. Minutes later, the sheriff himself let out a low whistle. There, carved into the hard-packed dirt near the rocks, was a single word, traced crudely with the end of a rifle barrel or boot heel. Cord. The letters weren't finished. The last 2 strokes faint, interrupted. But the meaning was unmistakable. The desert had spoken. So had the killers. As noon approached, dust devils twisted across the horizon, spinning up sand in thin, dancing columns. The heat intensified, drying sweat instantly, making the air feel like an oven's breath. A deputy remarked that the desert itself seemed angry, as if nature were remembering something it had witnessed and wished it had not. Radio chatter intensified. More units were dispatched. The bodies were covered and prepared for transport. Photographers documented every angle. But even as the official machinery of justice began to move, everyone felt the same uneasy truth settling in like grit beneath their collars. The Cordell family had not fled the desert. They had not vanished. They were still out there, watching. And the desert, ancient and indifferent, would hide them as long as it pleased. The investigation began with urgency, but moved with the heaviness of dread. The desert was too large, too empty, and too full of places where a family like the Cordells could simply dissolve into the landscape. By the afternoon of June 3rd, Gila County Sheriff's Office, BLM Rangers, and state investigators had set up a temporary command post near Dust Road, little more than a cluster of vehicles and folding tables shaded by canvas tarps. Radios crackled endlessly. Deputies wiped sweat from their brows. Crates of bottled water sat half open, their contents already warming in the relentless heat. Nothing moved except the investigators and the wind. The first order of business was confirming the victims' identities. Wallets were checked, clothing cataloged, identifying scars noted. It took hours. The men had come from so many places and left behind so few clues about themselves. Many had no next of kin listed or had families who hadn't heard from them in years. A few carried photographs. A child, a wife, a mother. Some carried letters they never finished writing. Investigators placed these items carefully into evidence bags, each one a fragile piece of a life that had ended too brutally for words. But despite the horror of the scene, the authorities weren't confused about who was responsible. Not for long. The Cordells had lived on the margins of Gila County for decades, shrouded in reputation, myth, and fear. Locals whispered about them more than they spoke aloud. Stories circulated about illegal traps set in remote canyons, about gunfights over water rights, about travelers who had gone missing after wandering too close to the wrong part of Muleback Mountain. Nothing was ever proven, nothing ever stuck. But everyone knew the family didn't tolerate strangers near their land. Deputy Lennox, who had been first on scene after Givens, wiped dust from his face and stared toward the distant slopes. "They're up there," he muttered, "watching us. Hell, I can feel it." No one disagreed because everyone felt it. The creeping sensation that the desert eyes had multiplied, that the ridges were hiding figures just out of sight, that the Cordells were exactly where they wanted to be, above, unseen, untouchable. While deputies secured the perimeter, forensic technicians combed the campsite. They recovered bullets, flattened against boulders, shotgun wadding tangled in mesh, and footprints beyond counting. But the most telling prints were the ones leading toward the western slope. Broad, deep, weathered. A ranger knelt beside them and remarked that whoever made them had been carrying heavy packs. Another replied quietly, or just heavily armed. In the afternoon, a helicopter arrived from Phoenix, sweeping the mountainside with slow, deliberate passes. Its rotors sent dust spiraling into the air. Deputies shielded their eyes. But the search from above revealed nothing. No movement, no heat signatures out of place, Nothing except the rugged, sunburnt sprawl of a mountain range that had swallowed secrets for generations. Sheriff Dalton, a man in his late 50s with sharp eyes and a square jaw, stood with a map spread across the hood of his patrol truck. He'd been elected 3 years earlier on promises of modernization and community rebuilding. But nothing in his career had prepared him for 14 dead men in a single night. He traced the map with his finger, outlining the area where he believed the Cordells had moved. His voice was low but firm. They know every cut, every ridge, every wash. They've lived here their whole lives. Hell, Red was born in these mountains. If they don't want us finding them, we won't. Not without a damn army. A younger deputy sweating through his uniform asked if they should bring in state tactical teams. Dalton shook his head. Tactics don't matter if you can't see your enemy. They know these rocks better than we ever will. By late afternoon, a group of local residents had gathered near the roadblock, a mixture of ranchers, miners, and curious drifters. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanging rumors as casually as trading cards. Some believed the Cordells would come down from the hills and surrender once they realized the enormity of what they'd done. Others said the family had been preparing for this for years, that they'd built supply caches, hidden tunnels, even underground chambers carved into the rock. An old rancher with sun-beaten skin and a crackling voice spoke with certainty. Cordells ain't running. They're waiting. They'll decide when this ends. Back at the command post, investigators worked relentlessly. They documented the ballistic evidence, noting the different calibers used. .30, 06, 308 Winchester, 12-gauge buckshot, 357 Magnum. This verified their earlier suspicion. There had been multiple shooters, each using different weapons, firing from different angles. They also found spent casings far from the wash, hidden among rocks and shrubs, an indication that some of the shooters had taken up high ground positions. It wasn't just an ambush. It was a coordinated purge. As evening approached, the bodies were finally removed. White sheets covered them as deputies lifted them onto stretchers. The desert wind caught the edges of the sheets, making them flap softly like fragile wings. A few deputies looked away. Others swallowed hard, masking their discomfort with stoic professionalism. But no one was untouched by the sight. 14 men, 14 futures, extinguished in the dark. It felt less like a crime and more like a small war. Sheriff Dalton gathered his team beside the patrol vehicles. His shadow stretched long across the sand, distorted by the setting sun. "We know who we're dealing with," he said, "and we know why they did it. The question is what they're planning next." Just as he spoke, the radio crackled with static. A ranger's voice came through, strained and breathless. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Deputies scrambled into trucks and raced toward the coordinates the ranger provided. When they arrived, they found a small clearing near a cluster of volcanic rocks. In the center of it stood an old wooden post, weathered, splintered, leaning slightly. Tied around the post with rusted wire was a piece of canvas, torn from one of the prospectors' tents. And on that canvas, written in blocky strokes, using what appeared to be charcoal or burned wood, was a message. "You were warned. Leave our mountain." Dalton exhaled slowly. The others looked on in silence. The message wasn't for the prospectors. They were already dead. It was for law enforcement. Night began to fall, drawing long shadows across the mountains. Coyotes returned to their restless howling. Sensing the tension spreading across the land, deputies set up perimeter patrols. Floodlights lit the wash where the camp once stood. Radios hissed. Boots crunched on gravel. Still, no one saw the Cordells, not a single figure, not even a flicker of movement on the ridges. But the feeling remained, growing heavier by the hour, that the family was watching every step, every car, every beam of light, because the desert had hidden them, and the desert did not give up its ghosts easily. Night settled over Dust Road like a heavy blanket, swallowing every contour of the desert except those caught within the harsh glare of law enforcement floodlights. The mountains turned to vast black silhouettes, silent, ancient, and indifferent observers of the violence that had soaked their soil. To the deputies trying to secure the area, it felt as though the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would unfold next. Radios buzzed with static. The air smelled faintly of gun oil, dry sage, and lingering smoke from the helicopter that had circled the ridges earlier. Every officer felt the same thing in the pit of their stomach. The Cordells were still out there, watching with cold patience. Sheriff Dalton met with his team near the command post, a small oasis of artificial light trapped in an ocean of darkness. The desert outside that circle of illumination seemed to expand endlessly, shadows forming illusions that made even seasoned officers turn their heads. Deputies walked their patrol routes in tense silence, boots crunching over gravel, fingers hovering near their holsters. The fear wasn't the kind that came from the unknown. It was the kind that came from knowing exactly what kind of men they were dealing with. Dalton reviewed the day's findings, flipping through notes illuminated by a battery lantern. The ballistic analysis was clear. Multiple shooters, multiple positions, coordinated timing. The Cordells hadn't acted out of sudden rage. They had planned the ambush, scouted the terrain, established firing lanes, and executed the attack with the precision of men who understood the harsh logic of the desert better than any lawman ever could. Dalton rubbed his temples, exhaustion weighing on him. 14 dead men, 14 families, who would soon receive calls that would fracture them forever, and a family of killers who saw themselves not as murderers, but as defenders of ancestral land. He had been sheriff long enough to understand something crucial. Men like the Cordells didn't panic. They didn't flee. They calculated. They waited. They watched. They believed the land was theirs, and that belief made them dangerous in ways outsiders could never comprehend. Hours passed. The night grew colder. Deputies took shifts resting in their vehicles, though no one truly slept. Coyotes cried intermittently in the distance, their calls bouncing off the rock walls like voices trapped in an echo chamber. Occasionally, a deputy would radio in after spotting movement, only for floodlights to reveal drifting shadows of creosote branches or the shifting sands of a small dust devil. Around 2:15 a.m., something changed. A deputy stationed near the southern perimeter reported hearing what sounded like rocks tumbling down the slope north of the wash. Another deputy confirmed hearing it too. A soft cascade, then silence. They swept the area with flashlights, their beams slicing through the darkness like thin sabers. But the ridgeline remained still, unmoving. almost mocking in its tranquility. One of the young deputies muttered that the desert was playing tricks on their senses. A veteran ranger responded quietly, "The desert doesn't play tricks. The ones hiding in it do." The statement hung in the air like a curse. The next disturbance came at 3:02 a.m. A deputy walking the western perimeter spotted a flicker of light high on the ridge. Brief, sharp, unmistakable. It vanished almost instantly. He radioed it in, voice tight. Within seconds, floodlights swiveled, bathing the ridge in harsh, white beams. The desert reacted with eerie indifference, shrubs casting long skeletal shadows. But no movement followed. Sheriff Dalton wasn't fooled. The Cordells were testing their reactions, probing the perimeter, learning their routines, marking their weak points. This wasn't a retreat. This was reconnaissance. By dawn, the officers had spent nearly 12 tense hours surrounded by an invisible enemy. The sun rose again over Muleback Mountain, casting long golden shafts of light across the wash. The land looked eerily peaceful, almost beautiful, so deceptively calm that new deputies arriving for their shift felt the scene didn't match the stories they had heard over the radio during the night. But the more seasoned officers knew better. The desert was merely covering its tracks, as it always did. Late in the morning, a break finally came. A pair of trackers, one a Navajo ranger with decades of experience, the other a seasoned state officer, began ascending the western slope where the boot prints had last been spotted the previous afternoon. They moved slowly, reading the ground with almost spiritual focus. The rest of the officers waited below, watching their small silhouettes advance. After 20 minutes, the trackers waved for the deputies below to stay back. They crouched near a cluster of volcanic rocks, examining something carefully. When they returned to the command post, their expressions were grave. They had found a discarded strip of cloth tangled on a thorned branch. It was sun-bleached, but the stitching was distinctive. Military surplus, Korean War era. A pattern known to be worn by Red Cordell himself. Near the cloth were fresh boot prints, sharp and deep, indicating someone had been carrying a heavy load. And next to those prints, faint but legible in the sand, were smaller impressions, made not by boots, but by the rounded end of a rifle stock. The Cordells had been there. Recently, very recently. Sheriff Dalton called for the helicopter again, hoping to catch them before they moved deeper into the mountains. But as the chopper circled, the pilot reported something unusual. Thin trails of smoke rising from hidden pockets in the rocks, barely visible to the naked eye. Not campfires. Those would have been larger, more obvious. These were small, controlled burns, used to destroy something. Papers, maps, supplies, maybe evidence. Dalton clenched his jaw. They're covering their tracks. But the desert wasn't finished revealing its grim secrets. While the helicopter was circling, one of the deputies patrolling a rocky ravine stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. There, wedged between two boulders, lay a metal ammunition box, old, rusted, and caked with dust. It had been left behind hastily. Inside were cartridges that matched the calibers used in the massacre. More disturbing still was what lay beneath them. A small stack of handwritten notes, scrawled on weather-beaten paper. They weren't detailed confessions or journals. They were warnings, lists of outsiders who had trespassed in the past, maps of ridge lines and potential ambush spots, sketches of the mine shaft labeled with names and years. Cordell family members dating back to the 1930s. It was not evidence of madness. It was evidence of preparation, a system, a plan, a generational defense of land that existed more in the Cordell's minds than in any legal deed. And then came the final discovery of the morning. A single spent .308 casing perched carefully on a rock at the edge of a ridge, placed deliberately rather than dropped. A calling card, an answer to every lawman stationed there. "We're still here." Sheriff Dalton closed his hand around the casing. It was warm, not from the sun, from being fired only hours earlier. The officers finally understood the truth. The Cordells were not running. They were not hiding. They were circling, watching, preparing for whatever came next. And the desert, silent, timeless, and loyal only to itself, seemed more than willing to help them disappear into its endless folds once again. As the sun reached its zenith on June 4th, the desert shimmered with a brutal, unforgiving heat. The land felt heavier somehow, as though the weight of the previous night's violence had seeped into the soil and settled there permanently. Every deputy, ranger, and investigator stationed along Dust Road felt the same tension, the kind that coils deep in your chest and doesn't ease with water or rest. The Cordells were still out there, not running, not panicking, just watching, waiting, deciding how the story would end. Sheriff Dalton stood near the command post, the heat warping the air around him. His face carried 2 days of exhaustion, but his eyes remained sharp. He reviewed the newly collected evidence, maps, spent casings, notes, and the unsettling realization that the Cordell family had prepared for something like this long before the prospectors ever appeared. These weren't impulsive men. They weren't deranged. They were survivalists shaped by decades of isolation, paranoia, and desert hard living. They believed the land belonged to them more than law, property deeds, or the state ever could. Around noon, the helicopter returned from its latest sweep, rotor wash tossing sand in spirals as it touched down. The pilot jumped out, face flushed, and hurried to Dalton. "I saw movement," he said. "North Ridge. 3 figures, maybe 4. Dalton didn't waste time. Strike teams assembled. 6 deputies, 4 rangers, and 2 tactical units borrowed from Phoenix. They armed themselves with rifles and shotguns, checked radios, and ascended the slope cautiously, keeping formation. The desert swallowed their footsteps almost immediately, the crunch of gravel fading behind them. Above, the ridgeline loomed like the spine of some ancient creature. The climb was slow and punishing. Loose rocks threatened to send men sliding backward. Scrub thorns tore at their uniforms. Sweat dripped into their eyes. But they pressed on, following faint tracks that wound through narrow cuts in the rock. The trackers from the day before moved ahead, reading the desert floor as though it were a book, written in a language no one else could understand. Eventually, one of them raised his hand. bringing the entire procession to a halt. He crouched, pointing to a fresh boot print embedded in a patch of sand protected from the wind by a boulder. "Cordell's came through here," he whispered. "Not long ago." The group advanced slowly. The air grew unnervingly still, the only sounds their breathing and the distant caw of a lone raven circling above. As they approached a narrow gorge, the trackers stopped again. The younger one frowned, leaning in closer to the ground. "Something's off," he murmured. The older tracker nodded grimly. "This isn't a trail. It's a funnel. A trap." The realization hit Dalton at the same moment the first shot exploded across the ridge. A rifle crack shattered the silence, echoing like thunder. A deputy fell instantly, struck in the shoulder. The group scrambled for cover behind rocks and scrub. Another shot followed. Then another. The Cordells had positioned themselves perfectly, high among the rocks, with the sun at their backs, silhouettes nearly invisible against the harsh glare. They fired with the speed and precision of men who had grown up hunting on these very slopes. Carl Cordell's shotgun boomed from a ledge above. Elias's scoped rifle snapped like cracking bones. Jonah's shots struck the dirt inches from the tactical team's boots. And Red fired with a slow, steady rhythm, like a conductor guiding a deadly symphony. The deputies returned fire, but the Cordells moved with uncanny knowledge of the terrain, slipping behind rock faces, ducking into narrow crevices, vanishing into brush before reappearing somewhere else entirely. It was like fighting ghosts. The desert amplified their gunfire, bouncing the sound across the canyon walls until the officers couldn't tell where the shooters were. Dalton knew they couldn't stay pinned down. He shouted for his men to fall back toward a wider clearing where they could regroup, but movement drew fire. A tactical officer took a ricochet to the leg. Another ranger's hat was shot clean off his head. Dust exploded around them with every bullet impact. The retreat became a desperate scramble. Rocks shifted underfoot. Sand slid in small cascades down the slope. The sun beat down with merciless intensity, turning the air into a shimmering, suffocating haze. But inch by inch, the officers managed to drag their wounded back toward a more defensible position. Then, suddenly, the gunfire stopped. Silence. Heavy. Oppressive. Unnatural. Dalton signaled his men to hold. No one spoke. No one moved. Minutes passed. A deputy whispered, "Are they gone?" But the desert answered first. A single voice rolled across the ridge, deep, weathered, carrying the authority of a man who had never feared the law. "You shouldn't have come up here." Red Cordell. The deputies scanned the ridges, but Red remained unseen. His voice echoed strangely, bouncing off stone, making it impossible to pinpoint his location. "This mountain is ours. Always has been." A pause. "You take one step farther, and we won't stop at warnings." Dalton stepped forward from behind cover, not enough to expose himself fully, but just enough to speak. "Red, listen to me. 14 men are dead. You can't take on the entire state. Surrender now, and you might make it out alive." The desert held its breath. Then Red replied, calm and almost sad. "No. The land chooses its keepers. You don't understand that. You never will. A second voice, Carl, shouted from farther up the ridge. We won't let you steal what our blood built. Elias's voice followed, sharp and furious. You come any closer, and we finish this. Dalton realized something then, something he had not understood fully until that moment. The Cordells weren't defending themselves out of fear. They were defending themselves out of legacy, out of a belief older than the law. To them, this wasn't a standoff, it was a final chapter. He tightened his jaw and signaled to his men. But before he could issue a command, the ridge erupted again. A hail of gunfire rained down. Deputies fired back. Tactical units advanced, using suppression fire to push up the slope. The battle intensified, dust clouds rising like small storms with every impact. Moments later, one of the tactical officers shouted that he had spotted movement near a cluster of volcanic rocks. Another officer fired suppressive rounds, forcing a shadowed figure to retreat deeper into a narrow gap. The team advanced in formation, using the terrain as cover. The first breakthrough came when Jonah Cordell was spotted attempting to relocate to a higher vantage point. A ranger took the shot. Jonah collapsed, his rifle tumbling from his hands and clattering down the slope. His fall kicked up a plume of dust that hung in the air like a spirit escaping. Elias roared in rage, firing wildly until a tactical unit pushed him back. Carl attempted to flank the officers but was cornered behind a curved rock wall. When ordered to drop his weapon, he aimed instead. The response was immediate. A ranger's bullet struck him in the chest. He crumpled against the stone, lifeless before he hit the ground. Red was the last. He fired 3 more precise shots, striking 2 officers and narrowly missing Dalton. Then he retreated upward, deeper into a maze of rock formations that only he fully understood. The officers pursued cautiously, hearts pounding, weapons raised. The climb grew steeper. Shadows deepened. For a moment, the desert seemed to blur the lines between stone and man. Then Dalton spotted him. Red stood on a high ledge overlooking the wash below, the place where the prospectors had died 2 nights earlier. His posture was steady, commanding, almost regal in its defiance. His rifle hung at his side, barrel glinting faintly in the sun. He looked down at the officers approaching him, and for the first time since the massacre, his weathered face revealed something like sorrow. "This land was all I ever had," he said quietly. "All my father had. All his father had. You don't walk away from that." Dalton raised his weapon, voice steady but heavy. "It's over, Red. Don't make us end it like this." Red's eyes hardened, not with hatred but with certainty. "It ended the moment those men put their stake in my ground." He raised the rifle. Dalton fired. The shot echoed across Muleback Mountain, rolling through the ridges like distant thunder. Red Cordell dropped to his knees, then fell forward, his body sliding a few feet before coming to rest against a rock. Silence enveloped the desert. The standoff was over. Officers moved slowly, checking the area, confirming the Cordells were no longer a threat. The sun continued its relentless climb, indifferent to the loss of life below it. Dust swirled lazily in the air as though the land itself were sighing. By afternoon, the bodies were transported down the mountainside. Radios fell quiet. Deputies sat on the hoods of their patrol trucks, heads bowed, processing the magnitude of what had unfolded. The desert, once filled with tension, now seemed eerily calm, as though it had absorbed the violence back into its ancient spine. Later, Sheriff Dalton wrote in his report, "It was not a manhunt. It was a burial. Not of bodies, but of a family's claim to a world that no longer existed." In the years that followed, Dust Road gained a reputation whispered among locals and travelers, of prospectors who angered the wrong mountain, of a family that lived and died by a land the law could never tame, and of a desert that remembered every drop of blood spilled upon it. And though the Cordells were gone, some rangers swore that on quiet nights, when the wind crawls low and gritty across Muleback Mountain, you can still hear Red Cordell's voice echoing faintly, "Leave our mountain